Good evening. Welcome to People's University Fairy Tales for Grown-Ups.
Hundreds of thousands of years ago, well before humans started writing down experiences, storytelling was used to pass down important aspects of history, culture, and morality. As fire became an essential tool for human evolution, enabling people to cook food and improve physical health and predators, it also became a focal point for telling stories. Firelight extended the time for communication and socialization, even after the sun set. While daytime talks centered on practical matters of survival and gossip, nights by the fire became the time for more intimate conversations about creativity, imagination, cultural institutions, empathy, cooperation, wisdom, bonding, and trust building. People sang and danced in the firelight as part of the storytelling. Transhealing was practiced. Tours are highlighted by the original social media, with the moon and stars in the dark skies above, circadian rhythms were altered, opening human brains to imagination, pondering the supernatural. The surrounding darkness reduced self-awareness, increasing vulnerability and lowering inhibitions. Stories about the escapades of known people of the past were popular. People learned about how others had tried to solve familiar problems. Humor was often an essential component. Older, more experienced people were often the most celebrated storytellers. The stories conveyed rules and rights, history, religion, myths, legends, folklore, and fairy tales, linking the deceased ancestors to the living. They created a big picture in large events expanding the community beyond clannish or village borders. Humans developed an appetite for stories by firelight that became ingrained into our DNA. This appetite for stories is still with us. Modern studies by anthropologists and archaeologists have confirmed this. People still endeavor to forget daily troubles by getting lost in stories, in books or films, music and dance, mostly at night. But now we must deal with the light pollution and other technological distractions. As we make this journey back in time to explore the roots of storytelling and fairy tales, we invite you to once more gather around the fire with us beneath the canopy of stars, planets, and our moon, huddling together to share and ponder our ancient stories once more. Welcome to People's University, Fairy Tales for Grown-ups.
Good evening. Whoever said all right. Whoever said that fortune favors mine knew more about it than Master Lonzo. So stick it to him. Fortune swings a wildly blind stick, raising up those who wouldn't dare to kick out of a bean field to great heights, or beating down those who are like the flowers of humankind, as you shall hear. Now it is said that in the town of Origiano there was once a respectable woman named Masada, and in addition to her unwed daughters, 6 little farts, as thin as poles. She had a son who was such a bird brain and a mutton head, he couldn't even throw a snowball. So she would sit like a sow with a bit in her mouth, and every day you'd hear her say to him, "What are you doing in this house? Damn the bread you eat! Why don't you make yourself scarce, you good-for-nothing piece of you-know-what? Get lost, Maccabee! Get out of my sight, chestnut husband. You must have been switched in the cradle. Instead of a Darlington's lovely baby, I got a lasagna gobbling pig." For all she talks, the boy just whistled. And so, it became apparent that Antonio, I was supposed not going to get into his head to do anything good. So one day, like any other, he saw that in his head a good washing without any soap. She picked up a rolling pin and sized him up for a jacket, fenced stocking, and staked when he least expected. Antonio did all he could to escape her hands, and once he did, he picked up one heel after the other and walked. He walked so far that by dusk, the lamps were being lit in Sylvia's shop. He came to the foothills of a great mountain. There, on the roots of a giant poplar tree, on the base of a grotto decorated with honeysuckle sat. Oh, dear mother, what an ugly one he was. was a little old midget. His head was bigger than an Indian squash. His forehead had lumps all over it. His eyebrows were joined. His eyes were popping out of their sockets. His nose was dented by two horses' nostrils that looked like sewer maidens. His mouth was as big as a grape press, with tusks that hung down to the little bones of his feet. His chest was hairy, his arms like spinning wheels, his legs vaulted like a stellar's. In short, he looked like a wicked demon, an old devil, the very picture of an evil shade. Roland would have been terrified of the sight. But Antonio wouldn't budge at the crack of a whip. Merely bowed his head and said, "Good evening, sir. What's up? How are you today? Is there anything you want? How far is it from here to the place I have to go?" Hearing his speech out of the blue, the ogre just laughed and said, "Would you like to work for me?" And he said, "But how much do you want per night?" And the ogre said, "Serve me honorably. You'll get along fine. You'll have many good times." So the deal was made. And Antonio began his service of the ogre, where food was practically thrown at his face. And as for work, it was pretty much a sheep pasture, so that after 4 days, he grew as fat as a Turk, and so massive and burly that he could barely see past the bridge of his nose. And nearly 2 years go by, and Antonio started to have the craving and the longing to see Pastoral again. And with all the thoughts of his hometown, he almost regressed back to his original state. The ogre, see through his entrails, recognized by the smell that his ass was itching more than someone poorly attended to, called him over and said, "My dear Antonio, I know that you are longing to see in flesh and blood. And since I love you like the pupils of my eyes, it would make me happy for you to take this journey and have this pleasure. So here, take this ass, and let it lighten the fatigue of your journey. But be careful. Do not say, 'Giddy up, shit, hold to it.' You'll regret the soul of my grandfather." So, Antonio climbed aboard the jackass and left at a trot. But before he got about 100 yards or so, he got off. He opened his mouth and he began to say, "Giddy up, shit, go!" The animal shit. Pearls, emeralds, rubies, diamonds, sapphires, each the size of a walnut. And Antonio stared with his mouth open at the wonderful bowel movements and superb diarrhea and rich dysentery of the little ass. And he took his saddlebag and gathered the jewels, climbed back on board, and made off at a wonderful pace. So he came to an inn. And immediately upon dismounting, he said to the innkeeper, tie this ass up at the trough and feed it well, but be careful. Do not say, 'Giddy up, shit, go to him,' or you'll be sorry. Oh, and can you find a real nice safe place for my little things here?" The innkeeper, after such an awkward request and peeking at the saddlebag full of jewels, was curious as to what those words meant. So after he filled Antonio up with more than he could eat, and more than he could drink, and stuffed him between a straw mattress and a thick blanket, when his eyes became heavy and his doors became rapid, the innkeeper ran off to the stable, where he said to the ass, "Good ship, go!" The medicine of those words, the animal performed the usual operation, packing its bowels of lovely streams of golden shit and bejeweled excrement. The innkeeper, staring at the rich defecation, decided to substitute the ass and trick Antonio, because he believed it would be easy to bamboozle and could be such a sucker that was before him today. So the next morning, when Aurora was pouring out her father's urinal full of fine red sand in the window of the audience, Antonio rose, wiped his eyes, stretched for half an hour, and after a dialogue of about 60 yawns and as many parts, called to the innkeeper to settle his bill. The innkeeper, after some dubious calculations, so much for the bed, so much for the blanket, so much for the room, so much for the soup, so much for the meat, so much for the stable, 15 for your health. Antonio gave beans, 5 more the substituted ass, took the saddlebag now filled with pumice stones, and made his way to his mother's house. And as he approached, he shouted, "Mommy, we're rich! Get out the fine sheets and lovely tablecloths and expensive blankets and spread them all out because I've got some marvelous treasures to show you." And Marcella immediately ran to a trunk full of her still yet unmarried daughter's trousseaux and grabbed the fine sheets and lovely tablecloths and expensive blankets and laid them out on the floor, onto which Antonio placed the donkey and began the intonation, "Giddy up, shit gold!" Shit gold you like. It will pay no more attention. He would to the sound of the lyre. After 3 or 4 more giddy up shit golds, Antonio grabbed a club and began to pester the animal, patting it up and down, touching it up, and paddling it with such blows that the poor beast lost all control below and took a fine yellow crack on the fine white cloths. Marcella, who had founded her hopes on enriching her poverty, now found herself with such a liberal foundation that her house reeked, grabbed a stick, and began catching Antonio so well with those that he ran off back to the ogre, who saw him coming. And because he was enchanted, he knew what had happened. He scolded Antonio for being such a fool to be swindled by an innkeeper, calling him good for nothing. "Oh, dear mother, drink this one up, who, in exchange for an ass well lubricated with riches, was given one lavish with makeshift mozzarellas." Antonio took his pill, took his punishment, vowed never to let a man call him or make fun of him again. And so a year passes. Once again, Antonio gets the fever to see his home and his family again. And the ogre not only gives him permission, but he gives him fine tablecloth that's all nicely folded up. And he says to him, "Take this to your mother, but do not be a donkey like you were with the ass. And until you are in her house, say neither open tablecloth nor fold tablecloth, or it will be at your expense." And he hadn't gone far from the grotto when he laid it on the ground and he said, "Open tablecloth!" And the tablecloth unfolded. Presented a trove of treasures to behold. Antonio said, "Close tablecloth!" The tablecloth folded itself back up, and he picked it up and he made his way back to the inn, where he said to the innkeeper, "Take this tablecloth, please, and be sure to put it in a safe place. But be careful, do not say open tablecloth or close tablecloth, or you'll regret it." The innkeeper, thanking his lucky stars, "Yeah, just wait with this now." And he gave it to him. He made sure to grab the monkey by the tail, stuffed him into a cot, and ran off to a private room, laid the tablecloth down, and said, "Open tablecloth," and the tablecloth unfolded, presented the riches. Sight to behold. If you said close tablecloth, the tablecloth closed, and he replaced it with an identical one, and palmed it off on Antonio in the morning. Antonio took that tablecloth once again back to his mother's house and said, "Mommy, I now have the remedy for our patches and rags and tatters. We can finally kick our poverty in the teeth." And he laid the tablecloth down on the floor and he said, "Open tablecloth! Open tablecloth!" He realized what had happened and said, "Oh, that innkeeper, he did it again to me. Well, he better watch out this time. There's 2 of us in this game, And if he doesn't give me back the things he stole from me, well, I'll turn his dishes to dust. At which point, Marcella, his mother, said, "Oh, cut it out, you accursed son. Don't break your back. Get out of my sight. I'm losing my guts. I can't stomach you anymore. My hernia is swollen and I get goiter every time you are underfoot. So cut it short and let this house be like a fire to you. I'm going to shake you out of my clothes and pretend I never even shot you." Seeing the lightning and not wanting to hear thunder, Antonio ran right back to the ogre, who, again, knew what had happened. Scolded him as well, saying, "You fought right. You gas mouth, you filthy gullet hen's ass. Ta-ta-ta, trumpeter of a carrier, if you would have kept your mouth shut, this would happen to you. But no, you use your tongue like the sail of windmill. Crush to dust all the happiness that this hand provides." So another 3 years passed without incident. And Antonio thought no more of his family than he did of becoming a count. And still, the old fever arose, and he wanted to see his hometown and his family again. Which the ogre jumped at a chance to finally get rid of this bother once and for all. And he gave him a lovely engraved club and said, "Take this in remembrance of me. Be careful, do not say up club or down club, for I never want to see you again." Which Antonio replied, "You don't have to worry about me. I'm grown up now. I've cut my teeth and I know better. So anybody who wants to fool old Antonio can kiss his own elbow." And well, the ogre was giving him some advice about the difference between talk, words, and actions. Well, Antonio, he hadn't gone far. But of course, he says, "Up, club!" These were no mere words. This was enchantment. The club rose up as if possessed, as if it had an imp in it, and began showering blows down onto Antonio's back and shoulders and spine, as if it were raining from the open sky above. And as he was being beaten like a piece of Moroccan leather, Antonio screamed, "Down, club!" And the club halted, rested, choked the tree. Now that he had learned the lesson at his own expense, Antonio took the club, went back to the innkeeper, who welcomed him handsomely. Antonio gave the innkeeper the club and said, "Take this club and put it in a safe place for me. But be careful, do not say up club or..." He'll be sorry. The innkeeper took the club, fed forward Antonio to eat, gave him the bottom of the jug, stuffed him into a bed, called to his wife to join the festivities, and once in a private room, the innkeeper said, "Up, club!" and the club arose and began seeking out the cores of both innkeepers' bodies, one blow after another, bang here, smack there, like the crash of a lightning bolt, and they ran back to Antonio's room and said, save us, please, we'll do anything, make it stop." Now that Antonio had seen that his plan had come to fruition, that the macaroni was falling into the cheese, he said, "Oh, there's nothing that can be done. You'll die from these blows unless you give me back everything you stole." At which point the innkeeper ran off, grabbed the donkey and the tablecloth, brought them back, said, "Here, take them, take everything I have. Please make it stop." And Antonio said, "Down, club!" Rested in Antonio took the donkey and the tablecloth, rode off to his mother's house. But once there, he performed a royal trial on the ass, and did a good thorough test of the tablecloth, made a store of money for himself, married off his sisters, and made his mother rich. Which goes to prove the saying that God helps madmen and children. Thank you.
That's Mark. How was that? And the West Liberty, West African Drum and Dance Corps. How about that? Now, we'll bring on our guest. Can you hear me, Nancy?
I can.
Great. I'm going to put it up on the screen. There you are. Professor Nancy Canepa did the translation and wrote the introduction and notes for a new edition of Giambattista Basile's collection, The Tale of Tales or Entertainment of Little Ones. Canepa's teaching and research centers on early modern Italy, 1550 to 1700. Can you believe the ogre came from the 1600s? I warned you about it. She's particularly fascinated by the development of new literary forms and languages during this period in genres that range from the fairy tale to the mock epic to the travelogue. Related interests include 17th-century Naples, dialect literature, the history of European fairy tale, and translation. Dr. Canepa regularly teaches courses in beginning language and on modern Italian literature and culture, fairy tales, and translation. Here is, all the way from New Hampshire, Professor Nancy Canepa.
Thank you so much. Can you hear? Yes. Yep. In a normal way without an echo? Because I'm kind of getting an echo. Yes. Yeah. Loud and clear? Okay, great. Well, good evening to all of you. I'm sorry I can't be with you there in person, but this is almost as good, I guess. Thank you so much for inviting me to this evening, the first evening, if I understand correctly, of a wonderful series that will take you through this month and into next month on fairy tales, adult fairy tales, which a lot of people aren't familiar with at all. They don't even know that fairy tales can be for adults. So hopefully we'll have some fun tonight. I couldn't quite hear all of the drumming, although the dancing was wonderful. I'm sure the drumming was as well. I did hear the storytelling of the ogre. That was quite amazing. Basile's tales are so theatrical, and so I really felt that the storyteller drew that aspect out in a wonderful way. And so now you have a sense of the kind of flavor of these tales. I did send to Sean 2 tales that perhaps he distributed, the Basile's version of Cinderella and his version of Sleeping Beauty, which is called Sun, Moon, and Talia. Did any of you get a chance to read those? And Sean, can I interact with the audience? If they speak, am I going to be able to hear them?
If someone has a question and they relay it to me, I can relay it to you. But
Okay.
They didn't get the stories. That's my fault.
Oh, okay. That's okay. Well, then
all I'm going to do is make them available by email.
Okay. That's okay. That's good to know, though, so that when we get to them, I'll give a little quick plot summary. So now I do have a PowerPoint that will kind of help us along here. So I'm going to share my screen. So Sean, I think you have to enable that.
Yeah, we're working on
Yeah, great. So,
Yep. We're seeing it.
Okay, so do you see this PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today I am going to talk a lot about the collection that the Tale of the Ogre that was just told came from, Giambattista Basile's Tale of Tales. But I'm going to start off with just some general definitions of the fairy tale. We probably, a lot of you probably know a lot of this intuitively, but I just want to make sure we're kind of on the same page. Then I'll go
I
on to
see
talk
what
a
you're
little bit
saying.
about the birth of the literary fairy tale. So when fairy tales start to be written down in Renaissance Italy. And then I'll move on to this specific collection, Tale of Tales. And then talk a little bit also about what happens after Basile, how the fairy tale history kind of continues on until we get to modern times when fairy tales are more associated with children and children's literature than adult literature. And the stills on this first title slide here are actually from a movie that was made that was based on 3 tales from the Tale of Tales by an Italian director in 2015, I believe. You see, it's a very visually rich movie, very, with its grotesque moments, just as we find in the tales themselves. Anyway, I would recommend this film. So let us dig right in here, and let's talk about storytelling in general for just a minute. Storytelling, of course, is something that all of us do every day. It's an essential human activity that we need in order to give our lives meaning. And storytelling comes in, comes in many different forms, from myths, religious tales, legends, romances, to anecdotes, life stories, the stories we read about in the news, Instagram stories, and so on and so forth. The forms and functions of stories that both individuals and communities tell can change a lot over time and space, and I think that's really one of the most fascinating aspects of stories and storytelling, looking at how and why they change over time. It's kind of an interesting way to revisit and understand history. Now, fairy tales are one of the most widespread and oldest forms of story. So it's only, and here we're talking about the European context, it's only in the 16th century that they begin to be written down by individual authors, but probably for millennia before that, they are circulating orally. And in both their oral forms and then their written forms, interestingly, they don't become a genre for children until quite late in their history, really, not until the 19th century. I'll have a few words to say about that afterwards. So in terms of narrative structure, what is a fairy tale? What are some of its most common elements? Well, and if we think of the tale of Cinderella, you see here on the left that magical transformation from the Disney film Cinderella. If we think of that tale, we'll see kind of all of these elements in that tale and many others as well. So many fairy tales start off with an initial lack or problem, which can take the form of the departure of the protagonist from home, or his or her estrangement from the normal domestic order, and that was the second case in the Cinderella tale. Protagonists typically encounter antagonists and helpers, friends and foes. They typically have tests, tasks, obstacles that they need to overcome, and they usually do that with the aid of magic. Magic is really a key element in fairy tales. They eventually discover the object of their quests or searches, and all of this leads them to their happy ending, in which the initial problem is liquidated, the villains are punished, and the protagonist marries, acquires riches, wisdom, has some kind of a happily ever after. Fairy tales are often stories of social mobility, kind of classic rags to riches tale. But they can also be tales of restoration, in other words, riches to rags and then back to riches. And in any case, fairy tales celebrate change, transformation. And as such, they're a hopeful genre, an optimistic, sometimes even a utopian genre that imagines better times, better conditions. So fairy tales are quest and test narratives. They're generally pretty short, familiar to us, to most of us. I love talking about fairy tales because everyone knows what a fairy tale is, or at least what some fairy tales are. If I say Little Red Riding Hood, you know what that means, right? Fairy tales typically take place in a fictional, indefinite setting. So they set up a temporal and spatial difference from the here and now. Once upon a time in a far-off kingdom, we immediately know that this is not our world, but someplace very different. The magic and supernatural that distinguish fairy tales is accepted by both characters and audience very matter-of-factly. So we know that in fairy tales, the rules of normal reality just don't apply. Fairy tales are plot-driven. There's often very little psychological development of characters in the way that we would see, for example, in a novel, say. There are many repetitions in fairy tales, through tests, the formulaic language of spells, incantations, and so forth. And fairy tales feature both fantastic and realistic people, creatures, and places. So we have royals, we have kings and princesses, we have mothers, fathers, their children, we have the rich and the poor, but we also have witches, ogres, as you just experienced, fairies. But in any case, all of these characters are involved in relatable situations that we can identify. And I just want to call your attention to this wonderful piece from Dina Goldstein's Fallen Princesses series on the left here. She plays around with kind of, what happens after the happily ever after of Disney princesses. Here we have Snow White, of course, living a very prosaic, kind of depressing existence, maybe dysfunctional even, after her happy ending. So why is it that fairy tales are so relatable? Well, many fairy tales are coming-of-age stories. They tell tales of maturation, initiation into adult life, identity formation. Of course, these are things that we all go through and that we're all very interested in knowing about. They reflect deep psychological and social experiences. They dramatize crucial family, but also larger human dynamics, such as in the context of the family, sibling rivalry, parental overprotectiveness or negligence, intergenerational tensions. Think back to Cinderella, we find all of those things in a tale like that. They dramatize issues having to do with growing up, separating from one's family, from one's community, and thus having to prove one's worth and agency, often through struggles and tests and trials that we just mentioned. And fairy tales often feature courtship, sex, marriage as part of this growing up process. Fairy tales, especially once they become kind of a staple of children's literature in the 19th century, offer guides to behavior in the form of models of socialization and maturation. What do I have to do to enter society? What do I have to do to become an adult? I like to talk about the double attraction of fairy tales. Their variety on the one hand and their repetition. So fairy tales on the one hand are universal. They exist all over the world. And the basic structure of a tale type, say Little Red Riding Hood, the basic structure of a 9th century Chinese Little Red Riding Hood and 17th century French Little Red Riding Hood is going to be very similar. Both of those tales will be recognizable as Little Red Riding Hood in terms of the sequence, the bare bones sequence of actions. On the other hand, fairy tales are also culturally specific. So by that I mean to say that each author or teller kind of fills in this bare bones structure with details, with descriptions, with anything that is important to them in their society. Each retelling of a tale offers a particular perspective or message. And those kind of cultural details are something that I find most interesting. If all of us in this room, in this virtual room, were to tell Cinderella as we remember it, it would come out a little bit differently, because each of us would kind of underline and emphasize things of that story that are important to us. So let's talk for a moment about the origins of the European literary fairy tale. So today, when we talk about classic fairy tales, we're thinking mostly about the Brothers Grimm's tales, the tales by Hans Christian Andersen, the Disney animated fairy tales, and maybe we know a little bit less about the earlier tales from Italy and France, which nonetheless were very, very important and very influential for those more well-known authors like the Grimms and Andersen and Disney. So the literary fairy tale first appears in Europe in 16th century Italy, that's the period of the Renaissance, with two very important collections. The first is called Le Piacevoli Notti, or the Pleasant Nights, and it was written in the mid-16th century by an author called Giovanni Francesco Straparola. Now, this is a collection of 74 short novellas, short stories, we could say. Only a portion of those are actually fairy tales, I think about 14 or 15 of the 74. Whereas in Giambattista Basile's Tale of Tales, which is the one we're talking about mostly tonight, which came out about 80 years after the Pleasant Nights, we have a collection that's entirely made up of fairy tales, and 50 of them in that collection. So these authored literary tales, these tales that are written down, published, written down by one individual author, published, printed, etc., are generally more complex narratives in terms of the structure, in terms of language, than the oral tales that have been circulated previously and that continue to circulate. In part, that's because these literary tales were written for a very different sort of audience, a sophisticated court, salon, academic audience in many cases. And that meant that these authors of the first literary tales were often using their fairy tales as vehicles for cultural debate, for social critique, as a way to kind of interrogate reality, to send sometimes rather polemical messages. And this was possible because the fairy tale was really not yet an established literary genre. It was kind of considered something at the margins of the literary establishment. In a sense, that afforded these authors greater liberty. They could say pretty much anything they wanted in these fairy tales. Here's just a little timeline to give you a sense of these various authors here. So Straparola and Basile, I've already mentioned. The next on the timeline is Charles Perrault's Histoire, or Stories from Tales of the Time Past, sometimes also called the Mother Goose Tales. And here we're in France in 1697. Next on the line is the Brothers Grimm in Germany with their children's and household tales, first edition 1812. The Danish Hans Christian Andersen's first edition of his fairy tales, 1835, and then the first full-length animated fairy tale film from the Walt Disney Studios, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, in 1937. So, going back to Italy, why did fairy tales first arise there in the 16th century? Well, again, we're in the Renaissance, and Italy was really the cultural and economic center of the Renaissance. Italian cities during this period had a very important role in international commerce, which facilitated contacts with other parts of the world, of course, especially the Middle East and India. And these contacts were not only in the form of exchanges of goods, but also exchanges of information, of stories. And so we think that's how a number of these tales entered into Europe through these sorts of exchanges. This was also an intense period of cultural activity. There were very high literacy rates in Renaissance Italy compared to elsewhere. There was a lot of interest in cultural innovation, experimentation, thus this attraction to new genres, such as the fairy tale. The Renaissance culture in general is a more secular culture than the previous church-dominated medieval culture. And so there's a greater openness to non-Christian marvellous sort that we see in fairy tales, which feature supernatural creatures like fairies and witches and ogres, but that really have nothing to do with the religious dimension. And finally, in this time period, there's also a kind of proto-anthropological almost interest in other cultures. So the populations of the New World that are being encountered in many cases for the first time during this period, but also an interest in Europe's own native exotic culture of folklore and popular culture, which until this point had really been a kind of submerged culture, not very well known on the part of the more general public. Just to give you an idea of where these the first two collections, the Straparola and the Basile, were created. So Straparola's collection came out of Venice, probably the most important port in Italy in terms of it being a crossroads between the East and the West. And Basile was writing from Naples, another very important port city. So both cities where there was a lot of exchange going on. So, Giambattista Basile and his Tale of Tales. This was first published in Naples in 1634-36, just a couple of years after Basile passed away. Basile was from Naples. He was a pretty successful writer, courtier, soldier at courts in Italy and abroad. So he published most of his work during his life in what was then the kind of standard literary Italian, but not his fairy tales. Interestingly, he chose a very experimental, non-standard, non-literary language for those, and that was his native Neapolitan dialect. There were a lot of dialects in Italy at this point. And that would have been the same language that he probably heard some versions of these tales in for the first time. And in fact, these tales that Basile is telling are not original tales that he created kind of from scratch, tales that were circulating already, again, in oral form, and that he probably discovered during his travels around the Mediterranean, in particular in rural areas of the Italian South. He then took these raw materials and embellished them using his own very idiosyncratic language, inserting many details that had to do with daily life, customs of the time into these tales, really making them his. But the basic tales that he's telling were not, he didn't invent them himself. Basile's audience, again, is an elite adult one. We think these tales first circulated in courts and academies around Naples, where they probably were used for conversation, for entertainment, storytelling games. This is a really important collection because it's the first complete collection of fairy tales in Europe. There are 50 of them, as I mentioned, the 49 fairy tales framed by a 50th tale, kind of generates the whole collection, and that 50th tale is also a fairy tale. And this Tale of Tales contains the first written versions of many of what today have become canonical fairy tales. So we've got a version of Cinderella, one of Sleeping Beauty, Rapunzel, Snow White, Hansel and Gretel, and others. Again, we're talking about 200 years before the Brothers Grimm, for example. So you already got, I think, a taste during that wonderful storytelling that we opened up the evening with, of Basile's language, just kind of over-the-top metaphors descriptions, his vulgarity in some cases. The fact that there is maybe a little bit more psychological development in these tales than other authors. And how Basile inserts lots and lots of references to the customs and daily life of his time into his tales. I'm going to read Basile's tales in terms of kind of thinking of them as a lens on the very troubled reality in which he lived. So these first years of the 17th century in which he was writing these tales are really a moment in Europe in general, in particular Italy, of crisis, of change. There are lots of there's lots of kind of social unrest, as you see here in the background painting, which depicts a revolt that took place in Naples in 1648. There are lots of natural disasters. Actually, Basile's death was caused by kind of after effects of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Naples in 1632. And so what I'm saying here is that we see a reflection of this very turbulent world, I think, in a lot of Basile's tales. His fairy tale world is a very complex one. The lessons he offers us through his tales are often very ambivalent ones. Sometimes he even seems to have kind of a pessimistic outlook on the human condition, which is not necessarily what we think of when we think of fairy tales, happily ever afters, and so forth. So I'm going to jump ahead now to say a few words about what happens in the 19th century, and then we'll return to Basile. The 19th century is a really key moment in fairy tale history because for a variety of reasons. One of these has to do with the fact that folklore studies becomes kind of an academic discipline in the 19th century. So the scholarly folklore studies we can define as the scholarly attention to the history, the diffusion, and forms of various popular, oral, and previously unstudied genres. So these are folk and fairy tales in their oral form, but also popular games, popular dances, songs, poetry, etc. So in the 19th century, there's a lot of collecting, anthologizing, and publishing of these sorts of materials. And in some cases, that's part of a project of affirming shared cultural heritages. And this happens at a time of nation building in Europe. So in 1870, for example, Germany becomes a nation. Same year, Italy becomes a nation. And there was an idea that circulated, especially around in the first half of the century and around mid-century, a very romantic idea. Something, for example, that the Brothers Grimm subscribed to. This idea that the authentic soul of a nation resides not so much in high elite literary culture, but in the popular collective traditions that kind of bond communities together. And that familiarity with these traditions is really important for creating a national spirit, a sense of the nation, a sense of cohesive community. So that's one important thing that happens in the 19th century. Another important thing that happens is that fairy tales kind of migrate from the salons and courts, courtly settings where they were typically at home in earlier centuries, to the nursery. So children's literature comes to be a thing in the 19th century. Childhood itself comes to be seen as a period in human life that needs to be considered on its own terms, needs its own culture and literature, therefore. And there are many factors that are influential in this regard: the rise of the middle class, greater child literacy, more stringent child labor laws, changing concepts of leisure time, and others. And so all of this results in the production of a body of literary works specifically aimed at young middle-class audiences. This is something new, this whole category of children's culture, children's literature. And fairy tales in particular figured very centrally in this new children's literature. And so it's easy to understand how the fairy tales kind of move over to this new genre, children's literature. They become more didactically focused, more moralizing. One of the aims of fairy tales for children was, in fact, to morally instruct, civilize in some way children. And in fact, the Grimm's Children and Household Tales, in its final edition, the 1857 edition, was one of the first children's classics, children's literature classics. It's a huge bestseller and really has been ever since then. So I think in this context, it's easy to understand how a text like Basile's Tale of Tales would not be a good candidate to enter into this new children's fairy tale canons. Why not? Because, well, it's never written for children. It's raunchy, it's violent, it's sexy, it's long-winded. They're not tales that would necessarily appeal to children or be considered appropriate as children's literature. In fact, it's really only in the past 50 years or so that Basile has kind of had a comeback and become something that many people are interested in. So let's go back, let's take a step back to Basile again. And I'd just like to talk with you about two of the fairy tales that we find there. One is the Cinderella Cat, which is Basile's version of Cinderella. And Cinderella is perhaps the most iconic fairy tale of all. There are hundreds of versions of it all over the world. It's a tale that deals with a dysfunctional family, as many fairy tales do. So we find sibling rivalry, we find lack of maternal love, absent father, all of these in Cinderella. And it's interesting that Cinderella has become synonymous with certain female models of passivity, hopelessness, the desire to be saved. For example, in later versions of Cinderella, in the Mother Goose Tales, Perrault's version from 1697, she's described as the daughter whose gentleness and goodness were without parallel. In the Grimm's version, she was always good and said her prayers. This is interesting that Cinderella has become kind of synonymous with, a good girl who needs to be saved. Cinderella is also synonymous with the underdog. It's kind of a classic underdog story. But Cinderella is really not always a rags to riches tale. In fact, after her demotion, Cinderella often simply regains her place that she had at the beginning of the story. And in Basile's version of Cinderella, the Cinderella Cat, we find a very different sort of Cinderella character. And so I'm just going to quickly tell you what happens in that version. So Cinderella starts off with, she already has a stepmother who treats her terribly. Cinderella also has a sewing teacher who she's very attached to. She's always complaining to the sewing teacher that she would prefer her rather than the stepmother that she has. And so the two of them devise a plan in which Cinderella will kill the first stepmother by, as you see in this illustration, breaking her neck with the lid of a chest. Cinderella carries this out. We're on like page 2 of the story, so Cinderella is already a homicidal at this point in the story. Her father then marries her sewing teacher, so stepmother number 2, who promptly pulls out from the closet 6 daughters that she had hidden away and starts treating Cinderella just as badly as the first stepmother had. Cinderella then takes things into her own hands and goes off. And here the tale gets rather familiar, and she goes off to the 3 balls at the prince's palace and manages to enchant him and also stoke the envy of her sisters at the same time, and she finally marries him and happily ever after. So in this version of Cinderella, we have a very calculating and enterprising Cinderella in the character of Zezzola. She kills her stepmother when she thinks she can get a better one. She enjoys getting revenge on her mean sisters by stoking their envy. And I just want to read you a passage from Cinderella's visit to the third ball, which kind of underlines this calculating nature of her. Basile tells us that she was magnificently dressed and placed in a golden coach, accompanied by so many servants that she looked like a whore arrested in the public promenade and surrounded by cops. This is really quite shocking. We're not used to thinking about Cinderella in these terms. But Basile really loses no opportunity to kind of underscore how Cinderella always is thinking in a very transactional way. She's always kind of calculating what she can get out of given situations. And so this comparison of her to a prostitute, I think, really underlines that further. So Basile's Cinderella, differently from some of the later ones, inhabits a dog-eat-dog world where she really needs to get down and dirty and actively navigate her own destiny in order to get ahead. So I think this is a great example of how Basile kind of shows us possible undersides of some of these tales that we later romanticize, sanitize, made kind of nice and pretty. In a way that kind of hides some of these darker aspects of them. The other one that I'd like to look at briefly is Basile's version of Sleeping Beauty. So in this tale, as in the other versions, a king comes across a woman sleeping in a palace because of a spell that was put on her. But in this version, let me read you what happens. He comes across the palace, he enters the palace. Finally, he arrived at the room where Talia is the name of the Sleeping Beauty, where Talia sat as if enchanted. And when he saw her, he thought she was asleep. He called to her, but no matter what he did and how loud he yelled, she did not wake up. And since her beauty had inflamed him, he carried her in his arms to a bed and picked the fruits of love. Then he left her in the bed and returned to his kingdom, where he did not remember what happened for a long time. So the king, in this tale, rapes Sleeping Beauty. Also, this Prince Charming happens to be a married king who has a wife at home. So we've got an adulterous Prince Charming who rapes Sleeping Beauty and abandons her to return to his wife. His wife, because the king is constantly talking about Sleeping Beauty and the two children that she eventually bears, summons the children to her kingdom and plans to have them killed, cooked, and then eaten by her husband. That plan doesn't work out. But her intention is to cannibalize these children. And then finally, Sleeping Beauty is also summoned to the kingdom, where the king's wife intends to have her burned at the stake. Sleeping Beauty, Talia, manages to save her life through a very slow striptease in which she removes garment after garment until, in the nick of time, the king shows up, saves her, and throws his own wife onto the fire to burn at the stake. So this is a very shocking undoing of our fairy tale expectations and our fairy tale memories of the tale of Sleeping Beauty, I think, in most cases. The critic, Francine Prose, talks about Basile's Sleeping Beauty in an essay that she wrote about the Sleeping Beauty tale type. In these terms, she talks about a sort of modified necrophilia, not exactly sex with the corpse, but rather sex with the woman who only appears to have left the world of the living. The insensate, slumbering woman, Prose says, is the ideal lover and mate in this tale. So again, Basile is showing us the kind of much darker side of what may, on the surface, seem to be kind of an innocent tale of romantic love. I'm going to skip ahead because I know time is going short here. But again, you know, the Perrault version is quite a bit different. And then what is you call the canonical version, the Brothers Grimm version of Sleeping Beauty called Briar and Rose. There's no backstory for the prince. There's no wife or mother, as in Perrault, that he has at home. And the tale ends with a truly romantic kiss. The Grimms tell us that he leaned over and gave her a kiss, and when his lips touched hers, Briar Rose opened her eyes, woke up, and looked at him fondly. So here we do have a Prince Charming, kind of an unproblematic Prince Charming. But what we find in Basile is something really vastly different. So, what do these encounters with these tales from Basile offer us, where we have Cinderella, who's an assassin, Sleeping Beauty, who is raped by a philandering king? Well, first of all, I think that being surprised, shocked even, out of our fairy tale expectations reminds us that fairy tales are dynamic. So there's no original, no definitive version of the fairy tale type or its message. And that can be something that's empowering to realize. Because it shows us that we too can continue kind of in this long line of storytellers to transform these tales, making them speak to and address what we find to be important. It's interesting also how older non-canonical versions of fairy tales, like Basile's, give us a much less black and white picture than do some of their Grimm and Disney counterparts. And perhaps this is more aligned or in sync with our shifting focus as modern readers, postmodern readers even, of fairy tales. We're kind of moving away maybe from the happy ending, the idea that everything will work out at the end, the cathartic nature of the tale, and moving instead in the direction of recognizing that the specific problems of fairy tales are more interesting to us because they reflect today's reality in a striking fashion. And so, just to conclude, a few last thoughts here. Fairy tales are enormously influential still today. They plot our lives and structure our collective imaginaries in ways that we're not even always aware of. They're really still, they've always been, especially since the 19th century, a major force of socialization and source of role models. They've had a huge influence on the structure and content of novels, Hollywood films, advertising, other popular media. And yet, the happily ever after that some of the canonical fairy tales put forth is, as we've seen through our consideration of Basile, an artificial milestone beyond which, beneath which, above which, whatever, lie much darker and messier tales that really never reach an end, be happy or not. And that's because fairy tales stage conflicting dialogues with the world around us. Fairy tales ask questions like, what do I have to do to obtain this, to obtain a happy ending? What do I have to do to be successful in society? But also, what does that cost me? Is what I need to do always compatible with being a good and happy human being? So tales like Basile's especially kind of problematize, again, that happily ever after, and get us asking these questions in kind of a non-ending way. Tales like Basile, discovering tales like Basile's, and there are many, he's not the only fairy tale author from this earlier period that writes very complex, interesting, stimulating fairy tales. Discovering tales like these open our perspectives to how those in different times and places have struggled to comprehend the world by asking some of those questions we just mentioned, trying to answer those same questions, and in doing so, trying to both imagine better worlds, but also realize that the efforts to create a better world really are never ending. It's lifelong. So I will stop here and invite any
have a question?
I have a question. We're getting the dates of when these came out or started being spoken. When did they start getting written and published in the books?
Sorry, I am trying to get to a full screen here. And, sorry, could you repeat the question?
The question was, we got a lot of dates when these stories were told. He wanted to know when they started to be written down.
Yeah, written in the books, published.
So the Basile's Tale of Tales, which is the collection that the first tale of the storyteller told, the tale of the ogre, and where the two versions of Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty that I just mentioned came from. That was first published in 1634 to 36. The tale is structured in terms of 5 days of storytelling. And so each of these days of storytelling was initially published as a separate volume. So we're in the early 17th century. And there was that one earlier collection of fairy tales, of novellas, in which fairy tales were about 20% of the whole collection. And that was 1550 to 1553. And then after that point in time, nothing much happens in Italy. But by the end of the 17th century, fairy tales become a very popular genre in France. And there, fairy tales really explode as a genre. They're published, republished all through the 18th century. But again, as predominantly adult forms of entertainment.
Additional questions?
So after that time period, after the 1800s, were more fairy tales written down, talked about? Is it simply word of mouth? I mean, what has happened since then?
Were you able to hear that?
No, it was very choppy. Sorry.
He wants to know what's happened since the 1800s in terms of fairy tales.
So fairy tales kind of become a genre for children in the wake of the Grimms. And then there's this tremendous activity of collecting lots of folk material in the 19th century. So by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, there's this wealth of kind of raw material out there that a lot of very creative writers incorporate into original works that have fairy tale elements, but that are not necessarily recognizable fairy tales as such. And so, if we think of Lewis Carroll and the Alice in Wonderland, if we think of J.M. Barrie, Peter Pan, if we think of Frank Baum and the Wizard of Oz books, there are many of them. We think of Carlo Collodi in Italy, with Pinocchio. These are all full-length works which kind of draw, that are for children, but that kind of become something that goes beyond the bounds of children's literature. They all draw on fairy tale materials in order to create literature that is fairy tale inflected, but something a little bit bigger than fairy tales. At the same time, other authors continue to write in the shorter form of fairy tales, both versions of common tale types like Cinderella and Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, and fairy tales that are maybe of their own invention, but that incorporate magic, that have supernatural creatures, so that share traits with more traditional fairy tales. And then when we get to the mid-20th century, of course, the whole Disney phenomenon has already started. As I mentioned, the first animated full-length fairy tale film is Snow White in 1937, and then that's followed by, I can recite the exact order, but there is Sleeping Beauty, and then all the way up to Beauty and the Beast in the late 1980s, and so on and so forth, and they're continuing to be made. But at the same time, there are, with the infusion of lots of funds into the public library system, I'm talking about the US here, around mid-century, mid-20th century, there's a boom in children's writing. And a lot of that writing is fairy tales, as well as other genres. Until we get to today there are lots of traditional fairy tales being written, rewritten, illustrated in beautiful editions. There are lots of not so traditional takes on traditional fairy tales for children, so literary writing books that take place in New York City with cats and mice instead of little girls and wolves, for example. That one's called Ruby, I think. Some of you may be familiar with that. There's lots and lots of young adult literature written with fairy tale themes. That's kind of a more recent development. There are very sophisticated adult authors who are writing fairy tales now for adults. One of my favorite collections is one called The Bloody Chamber by the British writer Andrew Carter. So there, fairy tales continue to blossom, perhaps even more so than they ever have, because of the publishing industry, because of the internet, the way we can access things now in a way that we couldn't 100 or even 50 years ago.
Yeah, you may have partially touched on this subject in your last answer. You mentioned Italy particularly, and France is where what we call the classic fairy tales were largely first written. What role, if any, did England have to play in the traditional fairy tales?
England in the 19th century is very important as well. The Folklore Society, which is one of the first organizations to kind of gather folklore scholars, is an English institution. There are many important, some of the authors that I mentioned who play with fairy tale motifs to invent their own very original works of literature, like Lewis Carroll, hail from there. And there are also important collectors in England in the 19th century. Some of you may be familiar with the Andrew Lang collections of fairy tales. So I don't know how many of them there are, but there's the Red Book of Fairy Tales. They go by color. The Purple Book of Fairy Tales, and they're collections of traditional fairy tales, not only from England, from all over the world, but that he kind of gathers in all of these volumes. John Jacobs is another very, very important English folk and fairy tale collector. He publishes, for example, a number of versions of the kind of classic British fairy tale, Jack and the Beanstalk. So there's a lot going on in England. Really, there's a lot, as far as Europe is concerned, there's a lot going on all over Europe. In Germany, of course, with the Brothers Grimm, I didn't talk much about them, but of course, their importance is enormous. Also in Scandinavia, Denmark with Hans Christian Andersen, but in the other Scandinavian countries, there are people also very busy there collecting a lot of traditional lore that includes fairy tales.
So speaking of color, the fairy tales are very white. The ones from the 16th, 17th, and so on. Although, there are many that are from Native Americans that we know about now. It's just interesting how white they are. Just her comment about that.
Sean, that was very choppy. Could you?
She says the familiar fairy tales are very white, Caucasian. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, so, we were talking today about European fairy tales, and they are very white. And in fact, there are interesting moments in Basile's collection, for example, where we do have, for example, in the frame tale, there is she's described as a Moorish slave, so a person of color who who robs the rightful bride of her husband, and is at the end of the fairy tale is greatly punished for it. So there are some very kind of depictions of people who aren't white in very, I mean, it's to be expected, of course, 17th century, very racially charged ways. Of course, there are folk and fairy tales all over the world. Here we talked about just Europe, but you can talk about African fairy tales, Asian fairy tales. We don't necessarily know as much from this same period about what was going on in other traditions, because in some cases, the African traditions, for example, they remain predominantly oral until much, much later. But there are plenty of scholars and writers today in different parts of the world who are, kind of entering into dialogue with both the European fairy tale tradition and their own native traditions. I'm thinking of Caribbean authors, I'm thinking of African authors who are, writing fairy tales of their own that, in many cases, kind of comment implicitly on the fact that often in the West, at least, what we think of as the traditional fairy tale canon is, as you're saying, very white. So there's kind of a lot of interesting contemporary reflection on that through the words of fairy tale tellers themselves, and also critics or scholars.
One more. Okay, thank you, Nancy.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I love events where I can bring what I do, in my scholarly work in the classroom out to the larger public. It's very important to me to be able to do that. So, thank you for having me.
I just want to point out to everyone that we did have a campfire. Aaron worked very hard on it. Had a bigger one, but it made a lot of noise. It's kind of like a death. But next week is Jack's site. And Nancy, you know him, right?
I do know him, yeah.
He'll be our, we're going to do this again. I hope you had enjoyed it. I thought Vince did a great job with the story. Nancy, you were awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. If anybody's interested in knowing more about Basile, Sean, you're welcome to share my email with the participants, and I'm happy to respond. Okay. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Get some cookies before you go.
Oh, I've heard it.
Also,
Yeah, it's all good.
They're throwing up people's things.